Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark seen yelling back and forth at each other on the bench. Stephanie White showing up her star player on the bench, saying, "Get the F out of your seat. Raven Johnson, take her spot."
On live television, in front of millions of viewers, a head coach yelling at her franchise player on the bench, telling her to get out of her seat. And Caitlin Clark, who has been absorbing institutional failure after institutional failure all season with the composure of someone who has developed a specific psychological skill just to survive this environment, shaking her head. Nope, 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 nope.
Talking about some defensive nonsense. My hands are straight up. I'm going straight up. Hey, you, sit down, take your seat. Caitlin, get your ass up. Caitlin shaking her head. Nope. This coach is an idiot. Nope. This coach is a dumbass. Nope. This coach is foolish. Nope. She's got no idea what she's talking about. Nope. 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 Nope.
I'm going straight up. Those are the words Clark said. Not an excuse, not a deflection. A direct basketball precise response to a coaching instruction she disagreed with and a refusal to be publicly dressed down on a bench for a defensive play that the game film and the post-game evidence both vindicate. Because Raven Johnson, the player pulled Clark for, the player White apparently prefers at the one position fouled out in 10 minutes of playtime and said nothing. This is the moment the basketball world has been watching build all season. The sideline confrontation that everyone tracking the Indiana Fever's coaching relationship knew was coming, that the rotation decisions and the press conference language and the organizational communication failures had been building towards since the first day of training camp. It happened on live television. Clark said no. White got pissed, and the camera caught every second of it. But what really started all of this is not what fans think. To understand why the bench confrontation between Caitlin Clark and is not just a dramatic sideline moment, but a documented institutional breaking point, you have to understand exactly what the camera captured and what each element of it means. The sequence begins with a defensive play. Clark contests a shot with her hands straight up, textbook defensive positioning, the standard that coaches teach players to use to avoid foul calls. The kind of defensive effort that does not generate criticism. The kind of positioning that, in any honest defensive evaluation, represents exactly what you want from your player, and disagreed publicly, on the bench, in front of cameras, in front of teammates, in front of millions of viewers who were watching exactly the kind of moment that defines coaching relationships, either as functional partnerships or as institutional conflicts that have passed the point of management.
Stephanie White yelling at Cece on the sidelines about defense, but Raven Johnson, who was supposed to be a defensive specialist, fouled out playing only 10 minutes and not a peep from Stephanie White. And this is the difference here as well.
Not a peep. That is the specific, documented double standard that makes the bench confrontation so significant, and that Clark's headshake was responding to as much as anything specific about the defensive play itself. Raven Johnson, the player Stephanie White inserted in Clark's place after the public bench confrontation, fouled out in 10 minutes of playtime. 10 minutes, while guarding the same defensive assignment that Clark had just been publicly criticized for at the bench. Johnson fouled out. White said nothing about that. Clark had her hands straight up on a defensive play. White made it a sideline confrontation on live television. The difference between how those two defensive performances were addressed is not a coaching philosophy. It is a documented double standard with one player's name on it every time.
Stephanie White doesn't hold all the other players accountable. That's not what happens. Never hear her holding Aaliyah Boston accountable. Never hear her holding Dantis accountable. Never hear her holding Kelsey Mitchell accountable. Never hear her holding anybody accountable that's not named Caitlin Clark.
Nobody accountable that is not named Caitlin Clark. That is the pattern, and it is a pattern that the bench confrontation made visible on live television in a way that no organizational spin can reframe. Boston is not publicly dressed down on the bench. Mitchell is not publicly removed from her seat during a live game broadcast. Fouls out in 10 minutes, and there is not a peep from the sideline. But Clark, whose hands were straight up, whose defensive positioning was textbook, whose response to a coaching instruction she disagreed with was to state her case directly rather than comply without pushback, gets a public bench confrontation while cameras roll. That is not accountability. That is a specific, targeted, documented pattern of public pressure directed at one player. And the basketball world watched it happen in real time. And Clark's response, the headshake, the nope, the refusal to simply comply and sit down without making clear that she disagreed, is the response of a player who has reached the limit of what institutional deference to a coaching staff that has been failing her all season requires. Not aggression, not disrespect, not the kind of sideline outburst that generates suspension discussions. A head shake, a repeated, quiet, dignified no. The response of someone who has been told enough times by enough coaching decisions that the staff does not fully respect her judgment and who has decided decided that at least in this moment, on this play, she is going to make clear that the coaching instruction is wrong, and she was right. Raven Johnson fouled out in 10 minutes.
Steph White said, "Fuck out my face, I'm putting Raven Johnson in." 22 gets up, Raven sits down, and then what happens? Raven fouls out in 10 minutes of playtime. So what, Raven Johnson can't play defense either now? Then coach properly.
You cannot coach properly. That is the verdict delivered not by a commentator's opinion, but by the game itself. The substitution White made in the immediate aftermath of the bench confrontation, the defensive assignment she gave to the player she pulled Clark for, produced a foul out in 10 minutes. If the coaching decision that produced the public confrontation had been vindicated by what happened when it was executed, had gone out there and delivered exactly the defensive performance White apparently expected, the bench confrontation would be a coaching story. The coach made a tough call. The player pushed back. The coach was right. But that is not what happened. White made the substitution, fouled out, and the outcome validated Clark's resistance more completely than any post-game press conference statement could have. The bench confrontation is the visible surface of something that runs much deeper, a dynamic that analysts and observers have been circling all season without fully naming. Because what happened on that bench is not simply about defensive schemes or substitution decisions or even the specific play that triggered the argument. It is about what Stephanie White sees when she looks at Caitlin Clark, and what she sees according to the people who have been watching this coaching relationship most closely all season is not a franchise player whose success she is invested in. It is a mirror, and the reflection in that mirror is everything White failed to become.
Caitlin Clark is everything Stephanie White failed to become. She sees Caitlin Clark and she sees herself, but not as a success story. She sees herself as a failure. Like, damn, that could have been me. No, it couldn't have been you. You were regular, schmegular, degular.
That could have been me. That is the psychology, the specific, devastating psychology that the bench confrontation put on live camera. Because when a head coach publicly dresses down a franchise player in the middle of a game in front of millions of viewers over a defensive play where the player's hands were straight up, it is not about the defensive play. It is about the accumulated weight of watching someone be everything you tried and failed to be. The commercial transformation, the sellout arenas, the television ratings, the Nike empire, the cultural moment. Every piece of what Caitlin Clark has built in this league is a reminder too of the ceiling she never reached. And the coaching decisions, the rotation interruptions, the minute restrictions, the public bench confrontations are the daily expression of that psychology, not basketball decisions. Institutional acts of resentment disguised as coaching philosophy.
I don't care how many hugs these two have. I don't care how many hugs they have. I don't care how many times Stephanie White pulls Caitlin Clark close by her hip. I don't care how many glowingly things Stephanie White says about Caitlin Clark in these radio interviews. You can't sit here and convince me Stephanie White actually respects Caitlin Clark.
Cannot convince me she actually respects her. That is the assessment, and the bench confrontation is the evidence. Because respect in a coaching relationship does not show up in hugs and radio interviews and carefully worded public statements about the franchise player's importance to the team. Respect shows up in how you handle the bench confrontation, whether you address the defensive play through the normal channels of coaching communication, a private conversation, a film session, a timeout discussion, or whether you make it a public confrontation on live television that costs your franchise player in front of her teammates, her opponents, and the millions of people watching. White made it public. White made it a confrontation. White pulled Clark in front of everyone and inserted a player who fouled out in 10 minutes. That is not hard coaching. That is documented disrespect. And the camera caught it in real time. The Brady Belichick comparison being made in the basketball world's coverage of this moment is worth addressing directly because it tells you exactly what a functional coaching relationship looks like against the backdrop of what Clark and White are actually navigating.
Difference between this and a Tom Brady and Bill Belichick going at it. One, Bill is a legend. Stephanie White is a slouch. Two, it was never a question whether Bill respected Tom or not. Everyone knew he did. Not the case here.
Never a question whether Bill respected Tom. That is the standard, and it is the standard that Stephanie White's coaching relationship with Caitlin Clark has never met. Because in a functional coaching relationship, even the confrontations, even the moments where coach and player disagree publicly, where the intensity of competition produces sideline tension that the cameras catch, are understood by everyone watching as expressions of mutual respect between a coach and a player who both want to win. The Indiana Fever bench confrontation did not read that way. The basketball world watching it in real time time did not see mutual respect expressed through intensity. They saw what the camera captured, and they made the same assessment that the post-game outcome validated. White was wrong, Clark was right, and the relationship between them is not one where that kind of moment gets absorbed and built upon. It is one where it becomes a clip that the entire basketball world watches on repeat. Let us be completely precise about what the post-game evidence shows, because the bench confrontation is not just a dramatic moment. It is the opening frame of a sequence that the game itself resolved in the most unambiguous possible way. Frame 1. Stephanie White publicly confronts Clark on the bench over defensive positioning. Clark's hands were straight up. Clark states her case. White overrules her. Clark is removed. The defensive specialist, the player White preferred for the defensive assignment that just generated a live television bench confrontation, fouls out. In 10 minutes of playtime. Frame 3. Stephanie White says nothing about foul.
Stephanie White told me we play faster when she's the... Listen to this nonsense. Stephanie White, you really think this team plays faster with Raven Johnson at the 1? Then how about you do us all a favor? How about you do us all a favor and spare us the theatrics, spare us the bullshit. Just get rid of Caitlin Clark.
We play faster with Raven Johnson. That is the coaching assessment put on record that the bench confrontation was built on. The explicit suggestion that the Indiana Fever's offensive pace is better with running the point than with the player who leads the league in assists, who is first in points created, who has been producing MVP caliber numbers while playing through a coaching environment that has been consistently, documentably working against her. Fouled out in 10 minutes. The team that was supposed to play faster with Jay at the 1 did not benefit from 10 minutes of at the 1 because was on the bench in foul trouble. Put there not by the opposing team's offensive sophistication, but by a player who could not sustain the defensive assignment for a full quarter without committing fouls. And the coach who had the television confrontation with Clark over defensive positioning had not a single public word to say about Johnson's foul.
Raven Johnson can't play now, or you can't coach properly. You can't coach properly. Brianne January can't coach properly. What does Austin Kelly do besides actually drawing up good out-of-bounds plays? Do you even listen to him or no?
You cannot coach properly. That is the institutional verdict, and it is a verdict the game delivered before any commentator had the opportunity to render. Because when you make a live television bench confrontation out of a defensive play where your franchise player's hands were straight up and then replace her with a player who fouls out in 10 minutes on the same defensive assignment, the coaching decision has been evaluated by the game in real time, in front of the same cameras that caught the bench confrontation, and the evaluation is not ambiguous. The broader coaching indictment extends beyond this specific sequence, because what the bench confrontation with Clark and the silent acceptance of Johnson's foul out reveal is a coaching staff that applies accountability with a consistency of exactly one, and that one is always Caitlin Clark.
Bill Belichick would hold everybody accountable. You hear the stories from Julian Edelman and Gronkowski about how he would get down in film, how he would get down in the locker room. Bill Belichick had no problem laying everybody the fuck out. Never hear stories about Stephanie White holding people accountable. Never hear her holding Aaliyah Boston accountable. Never hear her holding Dantis accountable. Never hear her holding Kelsey Mitchell accountable. Never hear her holding anybody accountable that's not named Caitlin Clark.
Nobody account that is not named Caitlin Clark. The Belichick comparison here is instructive, not because White is being compared to a legendary coach. The transcript makes clear she is not, but because it establishes what real accountability looks like in a coaching relationship. Real accountability is universal. It applies to every player in the locker, regardless of name, regardless of status, regardless of whether the coach has a complicated personal relationship with what that player represents. Belichick held Brady accountable. He held Gronkowski accountable. He held Julian Edelman accountable. He held every player in that locker room to the same standard, because the standard was about winning, not about managing personal relationships. White holds Clark accountable public on live television over defensive plays where the player's hands were straight up, and says nothing when the player she inserted fouls out in 10 minutes on the same assignment. That is not accountability. That is targeting.
Stephanie White was brought in to diminish, tear down, and ruin the Golden Goose. She's doing a hell of a job.
Doing a hell of a job. The bench confrontation caught on live camera, validated by Raven Johnson's foul out, framed by the season-long pattern of one-directional accountability, is the latest and most visible expression of a coaching agenda that the basketball world has been documenting all season. Diminish, tear down, ruin. Those are strong words. They are words backed by a season of documented decisions that are difficult to explain through any basketball rationale, and that become far more explicable when viewed through the lens of the psychological dynamics dynamic that the bench confrontation made visible in real time. White sees Clark, and she sees what she failed to become. And every coaching decision that makes Clark smaller, every public confrontation that costs Clark in front of her teammates and the viewing public, every substitution that pulls Clark at the peak of her rhythm, these are not basketball decisions. They are the institutional expression of a psychology that the camera finally caught and showed the basketball world without any filter. Here is where the full picture comes into focus, and the picture it forms is one that requires the Indiana Fever front office to make a decision that can no longer be deferred. The bench confrontation that aired on Leave Television is not a recoverable moment. It is not a coaching relationship that can be repaired with a press conference statement, a public hug, or a glowing radio interview where says the right things about her franchise play. Camera caught what it caught. The basketball world processed what it saw. And the post-game evidence fouled out in 10 minutes, not a peep from White, confirmed every piece of the interpretation. This is not hard coaching. This is institutional conflict that has become too public, too documented, and too damaging to the franchise player's professional environment to continue.
This is bad. Stephanie White, Caitlin Clark, bumping heads on the sideline. Stephanie White showing up her star player on the bench, saying, "Get the F out of your seat. Raven Johnson, take her spot." Stephanie White is an abomination. An absolute abomination. We were sold a false bill of goods. We were sold hope, and in return we got nope.
That is the fan base's assessment, and it is delivered with the kind of direct, unfiltered honesty that mirrors Clark's own headshake on that bench. Nope, 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 nope. Because the Indiana Fever did not hire Stephanie White to produce sideline confrontations with Caitlin Clark that air on live television and get validated by the opposing player fouling out in 10 minutes. They hired her to build a championship-caliber environment around the most important player in franchise history. The bench confrontation is documented proof that she has failed at that assignment, and the post-game evidence is documented proof that the coaching decision the confrontation was built on was wrong.
Listen to this shit. I thought Fever FC was trolling, but now I generally think Stephanie White might prefer Raven Johnson as her PG1 over Caitlin Clark. Stephanie White told me we play faster when she's the... Listen to this nonsense.
Might prefer Raven Johnson as the point guard one over Caitlin Clark. That sentence, if it accurately reflects institutional position, is the most damaging thing that can be said about a coaching staff in a franchise built around the player who leads the league in assists, who is first in points created, who has been producing MVP caliber numbers in a system that has been consistently working against her all season. Because a head coach who genuinely believes the team plays better with Raven Johnson at the one than with Caitlin Clark is a head coach who has made a decision about this franchise that is fundamentally incompatible with the franchise's commercial and competitive future. And the Indiana Fever front office has to decide immediately, with urgency, whether that coaching staff represents their direction.
It was never a question in the locker room whether the coach felt they were better with or without Brady. I'm not so sure everyone in this locker room thinks Stephanie White believes this team is better with Clark. Do you think that people in this locker room think Stephanie White believes this team is better with Caitlin Clark? I guarantee you, if you take a poll, it'd be split.
Split. Half might think she does not believe the team is better with Clark. Half might think she genuinely does. That 50-50 uncertainty inside the locker room of the team Clark is supposed to be leading is the most damning possible indictment of the coaching relationship. Because in a functional coaching environment, there is no ambiguity about whether the coach believes in the franchise player. In New England, nobody wondered whether Belichick believed in Brady. The decisions communicated the answer. The accountability structure communicated the answer. The public statements communicated the answer. In Indiana, the players are splitting 50-50 on whether the coach thinks the team is better without the most important player in franchise history. That is not a coaching relationship. That is an organizational crisis. And Caitlin Clark, who shook her head on that bench, who said nope to a coaching instruction she knew was wrong, who watched foul out in 10 minutes and processed exactly what that meant about the coaching decision that produced the public confrontation, is making assessments. The same quiet, private assessments that players make when the institutional environment around them has communicated, publicly and on live camera, that the person making coaching decisions does not fully believe in their success. The same assessments that eventually, when the contract window opens and the organizational loyalty calculus gets reevaluated, become very public decisions that franchises spend years recovering from.
How about you do us all a favor and spare us the theatrics, spare us the bullshit. Just get rid of Caitlin Clark. Just trade her. Trade her for some other bum in this league. Trade her for somebody else in this league. Let Caitlin Clark go somewhere else. Let her be free somewhere else.
Let her be free somewhere else. That is where this ends if the Indiana Fever front office continues to choose the coaching staff over the player. Not a trade demand from Clark, not a public statement of dissatisfaction. The natural, commercial, competitive outcome of a coaching relationship so visibly, so publicly, so documentably broken that the alternative, a different environment. A coaching staff that believes in her, an organization that does not produce live television. Bench confrontations becomes more appealing than whatever loyalty remains to the franchise that has been managing her down all season. The bench confrontation was caught on camera. The entire basketball world saw it. The post-game evidence validated Clark's position and invalidated the coaching decision that produced the confrontation. And who started the confrontation? Who said nothing when her substitute fouled out in 10 minutes? Who has spent an entire season demonstrating that her relationship with this franchise player is not built on mutual respect, is still employed by the Indiana Fever. Here is where everything lands. The camera caught Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark yelling at each other on the bench. Clark said her hands were straight up and she was right. White said, "Get out of your seat," and inserted Raven Johnson, and Johnson fouled out in 10 minutes. White said nothing about that. Clark shook her head, nope, 4 times, in front of millions of viewers, and the game proved she was right to shake it.
At some point, 1 + 1 has to equal 2, folks. At some point, 1 + 1 has to equal 2.
1 + 1 has to equal 2. That is the math. The coaching decisions plus the post-game outcomes equal the institutional verdict. The bench confrontation plus the Raven Johnson foul-out equal the proof that Clark was right and White was wrong. The season-long pattern plus the live television moment equal an organizational crisis that the front office can no longer manage with silence. The camera caught it. The game confirmed it. The basketball world has rendered its verdict. Now the Indiana Fever front office has to render theirs. Stephanie White was pissed when Clark refused her instructions. Raven Johnson fouled out in 10 minutes. Clark was right, and the coach who made her stand up from that bench has to answer for every decision that led to the moment the camera caught.